Hey everybody, it's your old pal John. Welcome to Humor and History. Today we're going to be watching Know Your Ally, Britain. This was made in 1944. The United States, I think it was the War Department at the time, not the Department of Defense, and this was to help them understand the Brits and give them tips when they went over there. Know Your Allies and Know Your Enemies. It's number 1 of the series. Okay. I think we can get through this a little quicker, right? Here we go. Showing American football. So GIs would have to sit through this and watch this before shipping off to Great Britain during World War II.
That game wasn't won by the man who made that touchdown. It was won by a team, and every man on the team had a share in winning it.
Good old American propaganda.
We're playing another kind of a game now, only this one isn't for fun. It's for keeps.
They just get right into it.
And this game won't be won by any single player either. It'll be won by a team. A team called the United Nations. The ball will be carried by the men in the backfield. The tough little guy from China, Big Joe Russia,
The little guy
John
from China.
Britain, and a guy called Yank, the 4 greatest backs in the world. So let's take a look at the men who carry the ball with us. Who are they? How do they live? What makes them tick? Let's start with the one that's toughest to understand. The one we know just enough about to confuse us, John Britain.
John Britain?
Here's where he lives. A little island no larger than the state of Idaho. 500,000 people live in Idaho. 96 times that many live in Britain. The Nazis and the Japs scream about Lebensraum, living space.
Okay.
But there are more people on a square mile of Britain than a square mile of Germany or Italy or Japan. More congestion than practically any place on earth except the New York subway or a sardine can. And that's a clue that explains a lot about John Britain. We build front porches on our houses because we didn't want to miss the chance to see our neighbors. But John Britain hides himself in a little box and plants a hedge around that to make sure he doesn't. Living that close to neighbors, privacy is part of the pursuit of happiness. And in the sardine can,
Feel free to
called
comment
Britain,
any way you want
they
on
learn
this.
to get on with their neighbors. They have to. He's too damn close.
He's too-
That's why they have so little crime in Britain. Believe it or not, even in wartime, the British cop does not carry a gun, nor does the professional crook. And in 1926, when the world heard of this stoppage of work in Britain, that industry, transportation, the whole life of the country had been paralyzed by a general strike, it was still more surprised next day to learn that the strikers were playing football with the cops. You can only understand that if you live in a sardine can.
Okay.
The second clue to this guy on our team. No part of Britain
sorry.
is more than 100 miles from the sea.
Interesting.
Every day for hundreds of years, years of peace and years of war, John Britain has seen ships sail from his island to the 7 seas. That means that whenever John Britain wants to bust out of his sardine can, it's the sea that gets him.
I don't know if I like the
He's been
sardine
busting
can
out
thing.
for hundreds of years,
Irritating.
and that led to Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, Canada, and for that matter, the United States of America.
How did John Britain get on our team? Remember 1938? The
Aren't we
Yankees
getting
won
on
the
their
pennant.
team?
Wrong way, Corrigan. The last trains ran on the 6th Avenue L. Well, John Britain got excited about the same sort of things. The bet he had on the Derby, or, as he would say, the Derby. His job. His kids. Getting his exercise on his day off. Preston North End taking the football cup.
At least they're not calling it soccer.
Only 300 miles away, people were cheering another kind of event.
Ooh.
And in London and every other British city and town, they read about what was going on in Europe, and they got sore about it. But they were also pretty well determined to keep it none of their business. Then, this looked bad. The Czechs had a mutual assistance pact with France.
I'm pretty sure that we did the same thing here in the U.S., so...
This might mean war, even though everyone was anxious to avoid it.
It makes sense after World War
They'd
I.
been
I mean,
through
of
one
course.
war, perhaps been wounded. Hundreds of thousands of their brothers and friends had been killed. There was nothing beautiful to them about war, and they had no desire for another.
Right. Okay.
In the
We're
last
talking about
desperate effort
Chamberlain.
to preserve peace, the Prime Minister today flew to Munich.
All was well.
I feel like a lot of this could be cut
Britain,
out.
France,
Like, they don't need to
Italy,
know the
and
history of
Germany
it.
were signing a pact at Munich. A pact in which the Germans agreed they had no further territorial claims to make. It was to be peace in our time. But it turned out to be a strange sort of peace. Hitler's first move was to break the pact he had signed. Wishful thinking was ended. Now they knew something had to be done about Germany.
They approved the Conscription Act, the first peacetime
Yeah.
conscription in British history.
Guys,
Just
feel
as
free
the
to
Selective
correct
Service Act
anything
was
on
the
here.
first in American history.
So,
The
yeah,
British had
original...
put their cards on the table. They had, in effect, said to Hitler,
That's enough. If you go into Poland, we'll fight.
Hitler smiled. Like other would-be conquerors of Britain, Philip of Spain, Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm, he thought he understood the British. He
Yeah.
didn't.
Well, it was more of a...
Sleeping lion began to wake up. He was a pretty drowsy lion for the first 6 months of the war. He
Jeez.
snapped and growled.
Wow, way to really talk up our friends. For, I mean, if you're... I don't
Dropped
know.
more leaflets than bombs.
Drop more leaflets.
He
Wow,
hoped
they're
that
really giving you
common
guys a hard
sense would
time.
return to the German people, and that they would throw out Hitler and the German warlords.
German
Instead,
warlords. Okay. So a lot of this probably is just going to get demonetized.
At dawn this morning, the German armies, without warning, invaded the neutral countries of Luxembourg, Holland, and Belgium.
Okay, so the Sitzkrieg was done.
The king of the
Phony
Belgians
war was
today
done.
surrendered his armies of more than
And
half a
Churchill.
million men.
Takes the reins.
Marshal Pétain, as French chief of state, has asked for an armistice. The issue in France is ended.
Okay, it's pretty
Britain
quick.
was alone. Czechoslovakia occupied, Poland defeated, Denmark gone, Norway gone, Holland, Belgium, France gone. Only Britain now. Britain was alone. Hitler considered the war over. Everybody considered the war over, except the British.
Yep.
At the 11th hour,
Well.
the lion was finally aroused.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost.
Is it me or was this
We shall
not
fight on
Churchill?
beaches, landing
I
grounds,
thought somebody else.
in fields, in streets.
I thought somebody
and on
else
the hills.
read this.
We shall never surrender.
We shall never surrender.
For a year, they took everything that the Nazis could throw at them. For
Yeah.
one solid year, from June 1940 to June of 1941,
Thank God they
they
didn't
were the only
understand
major power
radar that
fighting
well.
the greatest war machine in the world.
And sadly, because they started bombing the cities as opposed to the factories. Thank you,
They
Hitler.
took body
Great,
blow
great
after
error
body blow.
on.
Solid punches
on that
before
part.
they even had their guard up. All they did was take it on the chin and hang on to the ropes. They never went down.
Okay, there's your boxing reference.
And while they buried their dead, they prepared grimly and defiantly for the day when they could strike back. There were no victories to cheer them on, just defeat after defeat. Some heroic, like the beaches of Dunkirk, or like the hills of Greece, where British soldiers landed to keep their pledge of honor to the Greek people. Landed knowing they were facing overwhelming odds. But some less glorious. Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And
Singapore. Yep.
And Burma.
Yeah,
But through
Burma.
all these long months, the British people were thinking and planning and working only for the day when they themselves could take the offensive. And that day came.
Okay. Which specific day are they talking about? Is this the Dam Busters raid?
It was the British that made the Germans realize that war could be brought to German soil, too.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Day
thought-
after day, night after night.
Yes, the night bombings.
The offensive continues in greater and greater strength. That's in the air. And on the ground, 1,500 miles away in North Africa.
Okay. So the initial Italian invasion of what was it? Not Libya, Egypt, and then Tunisia. Yeah, Libya, Egypt, all that, and gosh, I can't remember. Was it Wavell that pushed them all back, or was it Cutting? I'm sorry, I'm not up on my generals at the moment. But like it was something like 2 divisions, and they were under strength, pushed the Italians back, like 200,000 Italians, and then Rommel comes in. Okay, so they're showing some Shermans. They're probably gonna be like, you know, hey, they couldn't have done this without our help, you know, that kind of thing. Which, I mean, it's not necessarily wrong, it's just, it's kind of, I see where they're going. They're playing to an audience. You have to think that there's an isolationist policy right now in the United States. When this, I mean, before this, you know, before we get involved. So you're trying to say, like, they desperately need our help, you know, kind of thing. And these are good people to stand behind, that kind of thing. Because you're trying to get people who just read newspapers and read what's going on. You really need to rile them up. So I see where they're coming from on here.
1,700 miles in 122 days. 1,700 miles of sand and wind and enemies. Once more, the people of Britain heard their church bells ring. More than 3 years earlier, they had been warned that this would be the signal of invasion. But long since the nightmare of the threat of invasion had passed. Now the bells rang out a song of thanksgiving, a song of victory.
This is, was it El Alamein, the first one?
Now there's the plain and simple truth about Britain. But the fellow that calls the signals on the Axis team knows his only chance of winning is to split our team up. So his team plays a game at which they've had a lot of practice. A game which has conquered half a dozen countries for them. A game called Divide and Conquer. Men like these tell the British we aren't taking the war seriously. They tell the Russians we are letting them down. They tell the British the Russians will sell them out. And they tell us...
It is manifestly ridiculous for the warmonger Roosevelt to tell the American people that they have anything in common with the British. On the contrary, they are different in every respect.
Well, there are differences, that's true. For instance, we drive on the right side of the road.
Okay.
But in Britain,
all right.
we
So
go
this
for
is
baseball.
these are the differences that are not so different that they're getting at, I guess.
They have a little number called cricket.
A little number. These Americans falling asleep.
Very well played, sir.
And anyone who ever drank coffee over there knows why there'll always be an England.
Okay, you're saying you're not getting like tea.
Give us a glass of half and half. Have you heard about it, boys? Give us another glass of half and half. Blimey, you'd have thought it happened to poor old Bill. And another bloke here.
So I went in to sup my dinner, but it's Dratton buckets and I was getting swarged. Lad, that's bad.
I would love to see the opposite take if Britain were to come and help. If Britain were to come and help the U.S.
Are they kidding, Jack? Why the cockamamie sprinkling some schmaltz mixed with celery tonic?
and nobody talks like that. So I mean,
corn in their mouth. You all can't understand a word they say.
Yes, there are differences. But there are a few things that Britain and America do have in common.
there's a lot we have in common.
And these are the important things of life. A little thing called a free representative government. We call it Congress. They call it Parliament. A little thing called freedom of speech.
No, in the next war, you've not got to go to it. They'll bring the war to you. And the thing is, if you take it from me, go and live at the Dorchester, because the trenches are just outside.
This meeting is called under the auspices of the American Workers' Party, an organization dedicated to the organizing of the working class of America.
Freedom of the press.
Okay.
Freedom of religion.
So GIs would have to sit through this.
But all these things are
This
the
is
common
just-
heritage of John Q.
I can't even
Public
sit
and
through
John
it.
Britain. 700 years ago, their ancestors fought for the Magna Carta.
No one will we deny or delay right or justice.
300 years ago, the Petition of Right.
No man shall be compelled to yield any tax without act of Parliament.
These principles came to our own country with the earliest settlers, and from them developed.
Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble.
We may make gags about each other's accents, but we speak the same language of freedom. Even during the American Revolution, when we were at each other's throats, the Earl of Chatham was free to say about us to the British Parliament,
You cannot but respect their cause and wish to make it your own.
and that is why in the heart of London, alongside his great naval hero, Nelson, John Britain has put George Washington. And in Parliament Square, the most sacred spot in the British Commonwealth of Nations, Abraham Lincoln.
Of course, Hitler doesn't like this kind of talk. His job is to sell the British that we are a nation of money grubbers.
Well, they're not wrong.
And gangsters. While in the next studio, he is selling us the idea that the British are gutless and dopes. The John Q. Public and John Britain are entirely different. All right, Hitler, where are these miners? Wales or West Virginia? These farmers, Devonshire or Wisconsin? These steel workers, Sheffield or Pittsburgh?
Fair enough.
These children, American or British, they live in lands which share the same hopes, the same ideals, and unlike the poor children of Germany, in lands where the truth is free.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk about we're doing this for freedom and whatever, but don't forget that Hitler was elected into power.
For instance, we don't go in for
Not
this
saying
kind of thing.
rightly or wrongly,
They do.
but
there's no mystery about that.
they lobbied too.
Remember our grandmother's house? It was old-fashioned, out of date, patched and altered to suit each new
Still is. That's what
generation,
happens with older
and filled
people.
with family relics even grandmother couldn't explain. Well, John Britton has been living in his house for a long time. And that's why to us, who live in a modern house that we built ourselves to suit ourselves, John Britton seems slow-moving and cluttered up with ancient traditions. Kings, for instance. The present king rode to his coronation in the same coach, to the same church, for the same ceremony as his ancestors did.
Hey, people put their hands on
job he
George
took on
Washington's
is
Bible
very
when
different from theirs.
when presidents take the office.
There have been some changes made. For the British king can no longer make laws or impose taxes or interfere with government. He and his family work as hard as any other citizen, doing
Well.
the job that the people expect of them.
There's
Today,
the
the king
former
is
Queen
the
Mother.
servant of the people and not its ruler. When an American is arrested and brought to trial, the bailiff calls his case.
The People versus John Doe.
But if
John
such
Doe.
a case were called in Britain,
John Doe is it?
The King versus John Doe.
it means the same
Okay,
thing.
so you guys do know John
Today,
Doe.
the British king is the symbol of the people. The British are great fans of the fellow in Buckingham Palace.
You know, and
But
I
when
have to
they
admit,
sing, God
I
Save the
really
King,
do
they're
like
not
the
worrying
fact that
about
you
his
have
health.
a king. I
They
think it's a
mean,
great
God bless the British
historical
people.
thing to pass forward.
And the dukes and the earls?
The monarchy, I should say, I guess.
But in 1911, the people took away the last remaining power of the lords to block the action of the people's representatives. Dukes and earls don't run the country anymore. Today, there are only two people who do that.
It's more
John
like
Britton
to me it seems like more of a
and his wife.
I don't know, like I don't want to say a moral
They go to
compass,
the polls,
but
just as Mr. and
a,
Mrs. John
it's
Q.
kind of like a
Public
steady
do
hand,
here
someone
and
that's
elect their
always there as
representatives
opposed
to
to
the House of
being
Commons.
in and out of power.
And
You
there
know,
they fix
new
the
prime
taxes and
minister,
make the
new
laws.
president. You know,
And if John
rinse,
wanted to get rid
repeat,
of the
that kind of
lords,
thing.
his representatives in
We don't
Commons
have
can at
someone
any
that's
time vote them out of
stable
existence.
like that. You guys do,
But John
and
doesn't
I
want
can
to get rid of
appreciate that.
So he confuses us by keeping dukes and lords in a country where unions have long been accepted as an essential part of the democratic system, where the Labor Party, controlled by the unions, is one of the two great political parties, where longshoremen and railroad engineers have been ministers of the Crown, and where for 30 years he has had a system of social security even more extensive than our own.
Yeah.
So when you read about Lord Louis Mountbatten or Lord Beaverbrook, former head of aircraft production,
It's sad the way
don't think
Mountbatten
they got
died.
their jobs because of their titles. They got them because they were the best men for the jobs. Just as Ernest Bevin, formerly a labor leader and now member of the War Cabinet, Herbert Morrison, who started life as an errand boy and is now Minister of Home Security, got their important jobs because they were the best men for them. With the things on the surface, the unimportant things, their John
Drive
Britton
left.
and our John Q. Public differ. But the important part of their lives, they run the same way. The democratic way. The free way.
So
But this gentleman never bothered about the truth. And when John Britton started carrying the war to Germany, he tried a new line.
The warmonger Churchill only wages this war against the German people to save the British Empire.
All right, let's take a look at that one. Here's the British Empire. And here's where the Germans were headed when Britain declared war. Does that look like trying to save the empire? Tackling Germany when it was headed into Poland and toward Russia? The one direction in which there were no British possessions?
Interesting way of doing that.
Poland fell, Hitler hinted at peace with the British. This was the perfect chance to save the empire. But it wasn't saving the empire that the British were thinking about.
The position of His Majesty's government in respect of any peace offer by Hitler. We are not, in any circumstances, prepared to negotiate with him at any time on any subject.
Yeah, there's great debate about
And
that.
after Britain had been on the losing end,
when Churchill came to power.
It had another
About
chance to
after
save
France capitulated.
Even now, Hitler thought John Britain would make a deal. We heard the British answer.
What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
You know, for all his ups and downs, Churchill was a great orator. I think he said something along the lines of, if you lock me in a basement with a bottle of, what was it, whiskey or bourbon or something like that, I could make his write a speech that would make everyone cry.
Freely given to Canada, Australia,
Different flag. Okay.
New Zealand, South Africa. These are independent nations with their own parliaments, their own laws, even their own money systems, their own tariffs, which often work to Britain's disadvantage, their own armies and navies.
Yeah.
Britain couldn't even take them into war if she wanted to. That's a problem they settled for themselves. Each one of the British Commonwealth of Nations declared war on Germany of its own free will.
Of course, no one ever talks about the British Empire today without mentioning India. And men of goodwill in Britain, as well as other countries, have been outspoken in their demands for Indian freedom. For no man who believes in democracy can support foreign rule of any people. But there are things that many of us do not know about India. For instance, that India pays no taxes to Britain, either directly or indirectly. That the Indians fix their own tariff laws, frequently to Britain's disadvantage. That of the Viceroy's Executive Council, 11 of the 15 members are Indians. And in the courts, 10 of every 11 judges. Furthermore, that no Indian is ever conscripted for service in the Army and Navy.
Well, there was a mass famine. That wasn't a great thing.
From 170,000 at the outbreak of war.
I think we did a video on that. I forget how many millions died.
Listen to the words of Field Marshal Jan Christian
From
Smuts.
42 to
He fought
44.
against the British 40 years ago, was defeated in his fight, and still became the leader of one of the British Commonwealths of Nations, Prime Minister of South Africa.
India, if she will, can be free in the same way and by the same means as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are today free sovereign states. Their peoples worked out a constitution for themselves.
Okay.
The same course is open to India, if the peoples of India will agree about the terms
The only
of a
thing I
free
would
constitution.
disagree with, I mean, a couple
Freedom
things,
isn't
but
a thing that
without
can
getting
be
into it,
imposed
is,
from can only be created from within.
you know, when you create your own
The Indians have a responsibility.
democracy or way of doing things,
That exist in the vast Indian
it
population,
was not easy
with
to
its
get
100
there.
different languages, its dozens of different religions.
It took a
And
long.
on March
It
the
just-
11th,
it
1942,
took a long time to get there, and it was a lot of British
government
influence
placed
on it.
itself
On it.
and promised full self-government to India if India will work out a constitution that will satisfy its people after the war is over. But during this war, military leaders agree Allied troops are needed in India as an effective bloc by the democratic world to keep the Nazis and Japs from uniting. Further, India provides the bases for United Nations bombers to get at the Japs in Burma. In other parts of the empire, too, democracy stands on guard. If it wasn't for the British at Gibraltar,
Yeah, a lot of Americans don't realize how helpful the Commonwealth forces were in the Pacific theater. They were quite
hanging
helpful.
on to them regardless of the cost, and their drive across Libya to Tripoli, there would have been no American landing in North Africa.
No, I mean that's something for another video, but
There's another tune the Nazis play about the British Empire.
The British are sitting back, letting others fight the war for them.
Ooh, we know that tune very well. Britain will fight to the last Australian or Canadian or New Zealander. The truth that thousands of Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders have gallantly fought and gallantly died in Crete, in Greece, in Libya. But there's something the Nazi mouthpiece leaves out, something pretty important. Out of every 10 inhabitants of the British Empire, 1 comes from Britain. But of the casualties suffered so far in this war, 7 out of 10 were born and raised in Britain. 1 of 10 in population, 7 of 10 in casualties. And in the air, of the planes flying with the RAF in Britain,
I don't know how true that is.
3 are manned by crews from the island. And of the planes on the overseas fronts, the Western Desert in Africa and the rest, 4 out of 5 are manned by boys from Britain.
There's
And
also
then
the
there's a
Poles.
little thing called the British Navy.
No.
From 1588,
The
when
French.
it licked the Spanish Armada,
Tons
to
of people.
1940, when we got moving on a 2-ocean navy, the greatest battle fleet in the world. That, too, is manned almost entirely by men of Britain, the little island in the Atlantic, an island of seafarers. And the British Merchant Navy, still the greatest merchant navy in the world, in spite of all that Hitler can do. Men from every British town and village in the stokeholds of 10,000 ships, on ice-coated decks, in grimy engine rooms, men who have been torpedoed twice.
I mean, they're not necessarily wrong. It's a little propagandistic. I get it. And so it should be for American GIs going over. But it does, I think, even under-deliver on the sacrifices that were made by the Commonwealth forces.
But we never hear about these things because of a curious character whose ways will never be completely understandable to an American. John Britton himself. He has an idea he shouldn't talk about himself and what he does. He calls it bad form. We call it damn silly. He'd say of a Spitfire, "Oh, she's not bad, little kite." But this man, the boss of the German Air Force, can tell us that the Spitfire has been the most deadly fighter in the world. And we certainly need an interpreter when this happens.
Hello, Bob. Had a good trip?
Oh, all right.
All right. Except that he spent 2 days in the icy waters of the North Atlantic after being torpedoed on the way to Murmansk. See this man? His name is Whitten Brown. And this man, believe it or not, is the first man who flew the Atlantic non-stop. In 1919, 8 years before anyone else, he and John Alcock flew non-stop from Newfoundland to Ireland. But as usual, the British let it go at that, and Whitten Brown went back into obscurity. There's nothing wrong with John Britton that a correspondence course in showmanship wouldn't cure.
I don't necessarily disagree with that attitude. A lot of things
For a moment, imagine that you're not American.
Commonwealth forces have done, and British people as in general,
You'd still be in uniform.
and they don't
For in Britain, every man between
flaunt
the
it
age
like
of
Americans.
18 and 41, unless he cannot be replaced at a vital workbench, is already in uniform. Your old man, too. He's had to quit guessing about the last war, for they're now starting to draft men up to 51.
Oh.
Dependents or no dependents. If you've got yourself into this mess, your draft board will say, "Frightfully sorry, old chap, but you're in the Army anyway." And your kid sister, if she isn't a sailor, or in the Air Force,
I remember the Queen was
or the Land Army, or a
she was a
ferry
mechanic.
pilot, or in the fire brigade.
Not the Queen at the time. Queen Elizabeth
probably in the
II,
Army.
before she was
Well,
Queen.
they've drafted unmarried women up to 30. And even if she's married, every woman up to 41 can be drafted to work in war plants. And it's a real draft. For 8 million workers, men and women, can't quit their jobs or be fired without government permission.
So
Britain
that's
is only
total
20
war.
miles from German guns and German planes. Everybody, man or woman, young or old, is in the front line.
It's not Sheffield, is it?
Maybe this isn't your idea of Britain. The ads were different, and you wondered whether they still made bows and arrows at the village forge. The ads kept quiet about industry, just as this one leaves out the aircraft plants and the oil fields. Well, they have the rich green fields you've read about, the quiet country lanes, but they also have the steel mills of Sheffield,
There it
the
is.
Pittsburgh of Britain. They have the picturesque little villages, the gently flowing streams, the lovely old castles. But they also have the shipyards of the River Clyde, not as modern as Henry Kaiser's, but still one of the greatest
Liverpool.
in the world. They have the old cathedrals, deathless reminders of a rich tradition. But they also have the great industrial cities of Birmingham, Glasgow, Manchester, Leeds. They seldom, if ever, saw an American tourist, but they made Britain, even in peacetime, one of the greatest industrial powers in the world.
Gotta love pollution.
And in wartime, even as late as July 1942, this little island, no larger than the state of Idaho, was making more war goods than we were.
I think it's funny that they keep comparing it to
Maybe you
Idaho.
thought John Britton sat there and waited for us to send him planes and guns and tanks. Well, he's deeply grateful for what our Lend-Lease did for him. It saved his skin when he was in a tough spot. But today, Lend-Lease works in more ways than one. For today, John Britton himself furnishes planes and guns and tanks.
Yeah, Lend-Lease
through the
was
same
rather
Lend-Lease
unconstitutional
to us,
on our end.
to Russia, and his other allies all over the world. In Britain alone, our forces have received, free from the British, 1.5 million tons of food, clothing, and munitions, and 2.5 million tons of other materials.
Yep, and
There's another thing you ought to know about Britain.
we did get some bases in return.
If your unit gets sent there, you probably won't be invited out for supper or for a drink. That's not because the British don't want to entertain you. They haven't anything to entertain you with. Britain is mobilized for war, total war, and that means an end to civilian supplies. If you were a Britisher, you wouldn't expect your girl to use lipstick. There isn't any, except what we bring over as bait.
Bait.
She wouldn't be smartly dressed, for clothes are rationed, severely rationed. It's very unlikely she wears stockings, for if she bought a pair of stockings a month, that would be all the clothes of any kind she could buy. That's some rationing. We think our gas rationing is tough, but John Britton gets no gas at all. He goes to a pub to buy a bottle
Oh,
of
really?
whiskey.
There was no gas
barkeeper
available,
laughs
no
in
fuel
his
available,
face.
petrol.
Grain is needed for industrial alcohol. Industrial alcohol is needed for munitions. And nearly all the reserve stock of British whiskey is kept for sale to America to pay for the goods Britain buys here. For don't forget, besides Lend-Lease, Britain buys and pays for vast quantities of goods. And it was the cash purchases that Britain made before we entered the war that gave our munitions industry its start and enabled us to build it up in record time. He goes to buy a pack of cigarettes. There probably aren't any. But if there are,
2 shillings, please.
That's 40 cents for a pack of cigarettes. 12 cents represent the cost of the cigarettes. The other 28, the tax paid to the government. For Britain is going all out in taxation. Nobody is making any money out of this war. Industry is paying.
Except for the
Excess
Americans.
profits tax is 100%. Labor is paying. The man who earns $33 a week pays 29% income tax.
I
The
think
rich
it's
man, if there are any of them left, pays an income tax of no less than 97.5%. And then there's the little man.
there are many of them left.
There are not many fat men in England nowadays. But John Britton isn't kicking. He knows 1 egg a week is helping him to win the war. The British rations are the rations of a free people. They could get food as they did in peacetime from Canada, Australia. But that would take ships. And the British prefer to use the ships for supplies to Russia, planes from America, troops to the Mediterranean. To win the war, every Britisher is on short rations.
Britisher.
Has been on short rations for 2 years. Everybody except the children. They get 4 times the eggs that grown-ups do. They get all the oranges that arrive in Britain. and practically all of the extra milk.
If there's anything that is incorrect on here, I would love to hear it. I'm sure there are something, but I would love to hear your take on this. Maybe you have grandparents, or likely grandparents or great grandparents that have talked about this. I would love to hear it from the British point of view, because this is clearly propaganda. But how much so, I guess, is the question.
Still I avow my hope and faith, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come, the British and American people will, for their own safety and for the good of all, work together in majesty, in justice, and in peace.
This is what the British are fighting for. They are an old people, a stubborn people, and sometimes they have moved slowly. But in 3 years of blood and sweat and tears, John Britain has found his soul. Now he is tough. Now he is determined, and now he knows where he is marching, to victory and to a new world.
Well, the Germans did say the British were some of the toughest soldiers. The Russians would go to the last person. The British were some of the toughest soldiers, and the Americans were kind of pushovers. All right. There we go. All right, guys, what do you think about that one? I didn't want to stop it or anything like that through it because it was so long, but let me know what you think. Any comments that I got wrong? What did they miss? What did they get right? And what do we not talk about these days that they mentioned in here that was more important maybe then and not as important to talk about these days? I'm curious. All right, have a great one. I'll talk to you soon. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Bye.